Karoline Leavitt removes reporter after he refuses to drop this question. The lights above Karoline Leavitt's head flickered as she stepped onto the stage. The cameras clicked on, and the familiar buzz of the studio filled the air. It was a live broadcast, an interview on a national news network, and Karoline was no stranger to the spotlight. As one of the most outspoken political figures in the country, she had become accustomed to the hard questions and harsh criticisms that came with her platform. Today's topic was a hot one that had been igniting debates across the country: free speech in the digital age. A topic Karoline knew well and had fought for tirelessly. She had made it clear in the past that she would never shy away from defending the fundamental right of people to speak freely, no matter how controversial or uncomfortable the opinion. But today, she wasn't just here to talk about the First Amendment. She was here to face an opponent who wasn't interested in dialogue. He was interested in one thing: bringing her down. Sitting across from her, as the host introduced the panel, was none other than Martin Foster, an established reporter known for his aggressive questioning and, frankly, his disdain for anyone who didn't align with his own liberal perspective. His reputation was built on being a master at making politicians and pundits uncomfortable, digging deep to expose perceived hypocrisy. Today, however, it would be Karoline under his microscope. She had heard the whispers backstage. The other panelists had warned her about his tactics. He didn't come to simply discuss. He came to confront, to challenge, and to, in many cases, discredit. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Martin had a way of framing his questions that made his targets feel cornered, forced to answer in ways that could be twisted. But Karoline had something Martin didn't have: an unshakable belief in her principles. If he thought he could trap her, he had another thing coming. The host began with the typical introduction. Today, we're discussing a crucial issue for the future of this country. How far can we push the boundaries of free speech in a world where misinformation and hate speech are rampant? We're joined by a panel of experts, and I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion today. Let's start with you, Karoline. What's your take on the issue of free speech in the digital age? Karoline took a moment, looking out into the audience and feeling the weight of the question. She wasn't about to give a rehearsed response. She would speak her truth, no matter how tough the audience or Martin's questioning might get. She looked at the camera, her eyes steady and calm. Freedom of speech is non-negotiable. It's the bedrock of our democracy, and without it, everything else collapses. In this age of social media, people are afraid to speak their minds, afraid of being canceled or silenced. But we can't let that fear dictate our rights. The truth is, people should have the freedom to express their views, even if we don't agree with them. And if we stop defending that freedom, if we start letting others decide what is and isn't acceptable speech, then we're heading down a dangerous path. The room fell silent for a moment. Karoline's words were powerful, but there was no doubt in her mind that Martin was already preparing his next move. He had his sights set on her, ready to dismantle her argument piece by piece. Sure enough, he didn't wait long. Leaning forward, his eyes fixed on her with an almost predatory intensity, he interrupted. So, let me get this straight. You're saying that even the most toxic, hateful speech that can incite violence, hurt communities, and cause real-world harm, should be protected under the guise of free speech? His voice dripped with sarcasm. The audience shifted, some clearly taken aback by the harshness of his tone. The host tried to step in, but Martin cut him off. Because let's face it, Karoline, you and I both know that some things aren't just opinions, they're dangerous. So why should anyone get a free pass to spread that kind of rhetoric? Is that what you're defending? Karoline's eyes didn't falter. She had been ready for this. It was the oldest trick in the book: attack her beliefs by twisting them into something extreme. The reporters and pundits who disagreed with her would always try to turn the conversation to those rare cases of extreme, harmful speech. It was a tactic designed to make her sound heartless, to paint her as someone who didn't care about the consequences of allowing dangerous speech to go unchecked. But Karoline wasn't about to let him get away with that. No, Martin, she replied, her voice steady and clear, I'm not defending hate speech. I'm defending the right for people to express their beliefs, even if they're unpopular. And I agree, words can be harmful. But banning them or silencing them isn't the solution. The solution is not to shut people down, but to engage with them. To challenge their ideas with better ones. The moment we give anyone the power to decide what speech is allowed, we lose the very freedom that defines us as a nation. Martin scoffed, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. He was already planning his next move, his next question designed to poke holes in her reasoning. He wasn't listening to her. He was just waiting for the moment when he could launch his next attack. Karoline didn't let him get the upper hand. You asked if hate speech should be protected, she said, her eyes narrowing, and I'm saying that speech, any speech, should only be restricted when it's inciting harm. Otherwise, we risk losing the freedom to express even the most uncomfortable truths. The studio audience murmured softly. Karoline's words were clear, and there was no mistaking the weight of her argument. She had set the tone, and now it was clear to everyone that Martin wasn't going to win this battle by pulling cheap shots or twisting her words. He was going to have to try harder. But as the host opened the floor for further questions, Karoline could feel the pressure building. Martin wasn't going to let this go easily. He wasn't finished yet. The air in the studio was thick with the weight of the conversation. Karoline had made her stance clear, but Martin wasn't going to let her off so easily. His demeanor shifted as he leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. He wasn't interested in engaging with her ideas anymore. This was personal. He wanted to break her down, expose her supposed hypocrisy, and make her question her own convictions. So you're saying, Martin began, his voice laced with disbelief, that people should have the right to say anything they want, even if their words lead to real-world harm? Even if those words incite violence? You're okay with that? His tone was sharp, as though he was searching for an opening to catch her in a contradiction. Karoline didn't flinch. She had heard this argument before. It was always framed in the most extreme terms: you're defending hate speech, or you're defending violence. They always missed the point. She wasn't defending the harmful rhetoric, it was the principle of free speech that mattered to her. But she knew the only way to fight this battle was to keep calm and keep answering the same question from a different angle. I'm saying that violence is the issue, Martin, not speech, Karoline responded, her voice calm yet firm. When people incite violence, they're breaking the law. And that's already illegal. But the moment we begin restricting speech for fear of what might happen, we open the door for censorship that goes far beyond what's necessary. Today, we're talking about ideas, and the answer isn't to silence the ideas we disagree with, it's to challenge them. We defeat bad ideas by exposing them, not by censoring them. Martin's eyes narrowed, a subtle sign of frustration crossing his face. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. He had expected Karoline to backpedal, to squirm under the pressure. But she was standing firm, confident, and resolute. The more he pressed, the more certain he became that he had to escalate. It wasn't just about free speech anymore, it was about breaking Karoline's image. You're still avoiding the real issue, Martin pressed, his voice louder now, challenging her every word. The fact is that some people don't just express their opinions, they incite hatred and violence. And you're out here saying we should let them say whatever they want. That's irresponsible. You're defending the right for people to harm others with their words. You can't possibly justify that. Karoline's expression remained steady. She had expected him to keep pushing, but she also knew that this was where he would start to lose control. His rhetoric was emotional, reactionary, and based on fear. Her job was to remain calm, to focus on the truth. If she could maintain her composure, she could turn the tables. Martin, no one is advocating for harmful rhetoric, Karoline said, her voice still unwavering. But I am advocating for the protection of free speech, the freedom to express opinions, even if they're unpopular or controversial. The reality is that the vast majority of people use their speech responsibly. It's a small minority who misuse it. And that's why we need to challenge those harmful ideas openly, not shut them down. You're making this about censorship, not about free speech. Martin, sensing the audience's growing engagement with Karoline's words, tried a different approach. So, you're fine with someone spreading conspiracy theories that can mislead and manipulate people? He wasn't asking anymore, he was accusing. You're really okay with allowing people to use their platforms to manipulate vulnerable individuals? Because I don't think I could live with myself knowing I defended that kind of speech. Karoline's eyes met his, unflinching. His words were clearly designed to push her buttons, but he had underestimated her ability to stay focused. Martin, people have the right to speak their minds, no matter how misguided or misinformed they may be. The solution isn't censorship, it's education. We need to teach people how to discern fact from fiction, how to engage with others in a productive way, rather than telling them they're not allowed to speak at all. If we start silencing voices, we're only hurting our ability to have meaningful discussions. The crowd, which had been sitting in tense silence, now seemed to stir slightly. Karoline's words had a calming effect, even as the tension between her and Martin grew. People were beginning to see what he was doing. He wasn't interested in a genuine conversation about free speech. He wanted to control the narrative, to dictate who could speak and who could not. And that was where Karoline drew the line. But Martin wasn't done yet. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping low as he challenged her once again. So you're telling me that someone like a white supremacist, a radical extremist, should have the same right to spread their hate as anyone else? You're really willing to go that far? The question hung in the air like a bombshell. Karoline felt the pressure mount. It was the classic move, force her to defend the indefensible, to make her look like she was condoning hate. But Karoline knew how to turn this around. She had done it before. No, Martin, Karoline replied, her voice even but carrying an undeniable strength. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that the answer to harmful speech isn't silencing it. The answer is confronting it head-on. If someone's speech is truly dangerous, if it crosses into inciting violence or harm, that's already illegal. The solution is not to silence their voice, but to engage with the ideas they're spreading, to challenge them with reason and facts. Free speech doesn't mean people can't be held accountable for their actions. It means we let them speak, and then we expose their ideas for what they are. The audience shifted again, and Karoline could feel the energy change. She had diffused the situation. Martin had tried to corner her with an extreme example, but instead of falling into his trap, she had taken the high road. She wasn't defending hate speech. She was defending the right to debate and challenge ideas, something that was essential for a thriving democracy. But Martin wasn't about to give up. His frustration was mounting, and his tone had become sharper, more desperate. So you're just going to keep defending your ideals, no matter what damage they cause? What happens when someone acts on those dangerous ideas? Are you going to be responsible for that? Karoline knew exactly what was coming. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when she would have to decide whether to let Martin continue pushing her or take a stand. He had crossed the line. It was time to end this. The studio had fallen into a heavy silence. The heat between Karoline and Martin was palpable. Martin's questions had grown more pointed, more personal, and Karoline had answered every one with calm and unwavering conviction. But now, he had crossed a line that Karoline would no longer allow to be ignored. The attack wasn't about her views anymore, it was a direct challenge to her integrity. Karoline could feel the pressure mounting. She knew she had to respond in a way that would not only end the barrage of questions, but send a clear message: enough was enough. Martin, sensing his opening, leaned forward again, his eyes gleaming with an almost predatory look. His voice was low, calculated. So, Karoline, you stand firm on the idea of free speech, no matter the cost. But let me ask you this, what if the speech we're defending is being used to incite real harm? If it leads to people getting hurt, violence being spread, what then? Are you still so adamant that it should be protected? Karoline's heart rate steadied as she took a slow breath. This wasn't about free speech anymore. This was about something more insidious, the implication that she was somehow complicit in harm simply by defending the right to speak freely. Martin had pushed her to this point on purpose, trying to manipulate her response into something the audience could turn against her. But she wasn't falling for it. "No, Martin," Karoline said, her voice now steady and controlled, "I'm not defending violence or hate. I'm defending the right to speak. And there's a significant difference. What you're doing right now is trying to force me into a corner, to make me answer for something I'm not advocating for. I've said it already, but you don't seem to want to hear it. I'm defending freedom, the freedom for ideas to be heard, even when they make us uncomfortable. The answer to harmful speech is not to silence it, it's to challenge it." Martin's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but then he pressed on. "You think people who spread harmful ideas, who, let's face it, have the power to inspire violence, should just keep spouting them? You think that's really okay?" He leaned forward, his voice rising with frustration. This was the moment, Karoline knew. Martin's tactics were not new. They were old tricks meant to bait her, meant to make her look like the villain in this story. But Karoline wouldn't play by those rules. She wasn't going to be dragged into a rhetorical fight where the stakes were defined by someone else's terms. She wasn't a villain, she was a defender of a principle that she knew was worth protecting. "No, Martin, I'm not saying that at all," Karoline responded, her voice firm now. She leaned forward slightly, meeting his challenge head-on. "What I'm saying is that the solution isn't to silence people. It's to expose their ideas, to engage with them in the public square. If we start allowing the government, or anyone else, to decide what is or isn't allowed to be said, we've lost our way. That's when censorship takes root. It's not about letting people do harm, it's about defending the very idea that we should be able to challenge even the most offensive or dangerous ideas with better ones." Martin's expression darkened. His frustration was evident, but now it was clear he wasn't just attacking her views, he was attacking her integrity. His next question wasn't about the issue anymore. It was about painting Karoline as someone who was willing to protect people who spread hatred. "Fine, Karoline, let's take this a step further," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You want to defend these people's right to speak? What about the people who spread hate, white supremacists, extremists? Should we just give them a platform too?" The room fell quiet as the question hung in the air. The audience was waiting, knowing this was the moment when everything would either come crashing down on Karoline or she would prove she wasn't going to let her values be twisted. The pressure in the room increased. This wasn't just a political argument anymore. It was personal. Karoline paused for a moment. The question was pointed, designed to make her look heartless, to trap her into defending something she would never defend. But Karoline had already prepared for this. She knew how this question would come up, and she had a response that would not only answer it, but dismantle it entirely. "No one has the right to incite violence," she said, her voice unshaken. "What I'm defending is the right to debate, to discuss, and yes, even to disagree. But when we start saying that certain people should be silenced for holding views that we find offensive, we open the door to mass censorship. It's not about allowing violence to spread, it's about keeping our society open enough to challenge every idea, no matter how extreme. That's the only way we move forward. And if you want to shut down every voice you disagree with, you're not protecting people from hate, you're protecting people from having to listen to the truth." Martin recoiled, clearly caught off guard by her directness. He had hoped that his line of questioning would cause her to stumble, to become defensive. But Karoline had handled it with the calm assurance of someone who had long since made peace with the principles she defended. His attempt to break her had failed. The audience seemed to hold its breath, and Karoline could sense the shift. Martin had underestimated her, thinking that with enough pressure, he could get her to admit to some radical stance. But now, the power dynamic had shifted. Karoline wasn't just defending free speech, she was reclaiming it, turning the debate into a demonstration of her strength and conviction. Martin, now visibly flustered, leaned back in his chair. His face, once smug and confident, now showed signs of frustration. He had nothing more to say. He had been beaten, not by a brilliant counter-argument, but by Karoline's unwavering commitment to her beliefs. The host, sensing the moment had reached its peak, quickly intervened. "Well, that was certainly intense," he said, his voice slightly strained. "We'll have to wrap up the discussion there. Thank you to all our panelists for a passionate exchange today." Karoline didn't wait for the host to finish. She stood up, her posture straight and dignified, and made her way off the stage without a second glance at Martin. The room was still in shock, and the moment felt like a punch in the gut. Karoline had held her ground, and in doing so, she had won. The battle had been intense, but Karoline had emerged victorious, not with volume or aggression, but with quiet strength, integrity, and the unshakable belief in the power of free speech. The atmosphere in the studio was electric as Karoline walked off the stage, her head held high. The tension that had been building throughout the debate had finally reached its peak, and now, as the host attempted to regain control of the situation, the room felt charged with energy. The debate had taken an unexpected turn, and Karoline had emerged not just as the defender of free speech, but as the undisputed victor of the exchange. Martin Foster, the seasoned reporter, had been left speechless, his arguments deflated by her calm, resolute responses. As Karoline made her way to the backstage area, she could feel the eyes of the crew on her, their silent acknowledgement of her victory in the debate. There was no denying it, Karoline had held her own, and she had done so with grace, making it clear that her principles could not be undermined. Yet, as the adrenaline began to fade, a sense of unease started to creep in. Backstage, several members of the production team approached her with polite congratulations. Some were genuine, others a bit more reserved. But Karoline barely registered their words. Her mind was still replaying the moment when Martin had tried to push her into a corner, attempting to brand her as heartless or complicit in the spread of hate. She had expected that type of question, but she hadn't anticipated how it would feel to face such an aggressive and personal line of attack. Still, she had handled it well. She hadn't backed down. And that was the point. Just as Karoline was about to leave the backstage area, she was stopped by someone she hadn't expected to see, Martin Foster. He had been sitting with his arms crossed earlier, defeated by the force of her argument, but now, as he approached her, there was a different expression in his eyes. His frustration had given way to something else, reluctance. It wasn't the same sharp, confident man from earlier. There was a hint of humility in his demeanor. "Karoline," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I just wanted to say, I didn't expect that. You really made me rethink some things." Karoline raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift in his tone. This wasn't the Martin she'd been battling with for the past hour, the aggressive journalist who had attacked her views at every turn. This was something else entirely. It was almost an admission of respect, though she couldn't help but wonder if it came from genuine reflection or the sting of defeat. "I'm not here to convince you, Martin," Karoline replied, her voice calm and steady. "I'm here to defend my beliefs, just like you're defending yours. But when you push someone to the point of trying to break them, you stop having a conversation and start fighting to win for the sake of winning. That's not what I'm about." Martin seemed to nod slowly, taking in her words. There was an awkward pause before he spoke again, this time with less arrogance in his voice. "I think I get it now. It's not about winning the argument, is it? It's about standing for something." Karoline studied him for a moment. She didn't know what his angle was, but there was sincerity in his voice now that hadn't been there before. "You're right. It's about standing firm for what you believe in, even when the world is trying to make you back down. The minute we stop defending our right to speak freely, we lose the very essence of who we are as a society." Martin's eyes softened, and he offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'll admit, I thought you were just spouting rhetoric. But what you said about censorship, it stuck with me. Maybe I've been too quick to judge people like you." For a brief moment, Karoline allowed herself to let down her guard, if only slightly. She had been prepared for the usual barrage of attacks and condescending remarks from Martin, but now, in this quiet moment, it seemed like he was genuinely grappling with the conversation they had just had. "I don't expect you to change your views overnight, Martin," Karoline said softly. But it's important that we have these conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. Otherwise, we're all just silencing each other without realizing it. Martin nodded, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quieter humility. I guess that's the part one didn't see. Maybe we all need to listen a little more and judge a little less. Karoline offered him a small smile, but it wasn't one of triumph. It was a smile of mutual respect. She had made her point, and now, it seemed, he was listening. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. As the crew began to pack up and the lights dimmed in the studio, Karoline could sense that the conversation they had started today would continue long after the cameras had stopped rolling. The media, of course, would twist the story, framing her as the combative politician, the unyielding defender of free speech. But Karoline knew that what mattered was the conversation. What mattered was that the message had been heard. Later, as she stood outside the studio in the crisp evening air, Karoline took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. She had faced one of her toughest adversaries yet. She had stood firm. And in doing so, she had proven that the fight for free speech wasn't just about defending the right to speak, it was about ensuring that every voice had the freedom to be heard, without fear of being silenced by those who disagreed. The victory had been hers, but it was not the end. Karoline's journey had just begun. She wasn't finished yet. The next few days after the interview were a whirlwind for Karoline. The media buzzed with headlines, some praising her calm, collected defense of free speech, while others criticized her refusal to acknowledge the limits of that freedom. The story was unfolding in every direction, with different outlets interpreting her words through their own lens, each trying to spin the narrative. It was the price she paid for standing up for what she believed in. But as the days went by, Karoline felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She wasn't interested in winning popularity contests or making headlines. What mattered was that she had stuck to her principles. She had made her case without resorting to sensationalism or drama. That, in itself, was a victory. However, what Karoline didn't anticipate was the flood of support that came from unexpected places. After her exchange with Martin, her phone had been filled with messages, texts from fellow politicians, activists, and people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some were brief, a simple "well done" or "you handled that like a pro," but others were more detailed, reaching out to thank her for speaking out for free speech in a time when it felt as though more and more people were silenced for fear of disagreement. It was in the quiet of her apartment, as she sat down to sift through these messages, that she received one that stood out, a message from Martin Foster. Karoline, it began, I wanted to reach out to you personally to say that I've thought a lot about our conversation, and you made some points that I can't ignore. While I still stand by my belief that some speech should be regulated for the good of society, I respect how passionately and consistently you argued for your position. I'm not always right, and I'm willing to acknowledge that. Thank you for the thought-provoking exchange. Karoline stared at the message for a moment, the quiet flicker of disbelief passing through her. She hadn't expected an apology from Martin, but this message, this acknowledgement, was more than she could have hoped for. He wasn't conceding her points entirely, but the shift in his tone was undeniable. She thought back to the final moments of the debate, the way she had stood her ground, how she had refused to let him control the conversation. That moment of confidence had felt right, but now, reading Martin's words, she realized it wasn't just about winning the argument. It was about planting seeds for future discussions, even with those who didn't immediately see things her way. Karoline quickly typed back her response. Thank you, Martin. I appreciate your message. I know our views differ, but the fact that we can have this conversation is what makes it all worthwhile. I hope we can continue to engage on this topic. Our society needs more open dialogue, not less. Take care. The exchange felt like a small victory, a confirmation that, despite the heated nature of their debate, respect could still be maintained. It wasn't just about the headlines, but about changing minds and fostering dialogue. Later that evening, Karoline received an invitation to speak at a major event on free speech, hosted by an organization known for promoting civil liberties. The invitation came from a group she had long admired. They had seen the interview and were eager to have her speak to a larger audience, one that would appreciate her views and the fortitude with which she defended them. As she read the details, Karoline realized how far her message had traveled, how many people had been moved by her words. It wasn't just the victory in the debate that mattered, it was the ripple effect of that victory. Conversations were happening. Walls of silence were starting to crack, and people were beginning to listen to one another again, instead of shutting down opposing views. The next morning, Karoline stood in front of her mirror, looking at herself as she tied her hair back into a tight ponytail. She looked at her reflection, wondering if this moment would truly lead to change or if the conversation would ultimately be forgotten. But then, she remembered her final words to Martin about not letting fear dictate who should be silenced. She wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. The fight for free speech was a long and difficult one. The challenges ahead would be daunting. But Karoline knew she wasn't alone. The people who had reached out to her, the ones who had supported her, were part of a larger movement, a movement that believed in the power of open dialogue and the importance of listening to voices from all sides, even when those voices were uncomfortable. As she left her apartment, ready to speak at the event, Karoline felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always known that this fight was bigger than any one person, any one debate. But now, standing on the precipice of something much larger, she knew that her role had only just begun. There was a lot of work left to do, but Karoline Leavitt was prepared. With each step forward, she would continue to champion the rights of those who had been silenced, to make sure that no voice went unheard. And no matter how many times she would be attacked, she would never back down. Because, for Karoline, this was more than just an issue. It was a cause. A cause worth fighting for.